Hello.
Hi, Sam.
How you doing?
Good. I love the background.
Ah, thank you. Oh, the beard. Whoa.
It reminds of my childhood.
Yeah. When there was nothing on TV.
Exactly. 6 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
Transmission not started yet.
No cartoons. Yeah.
Oh,
How have you been getting on?
What? Sorry?
How have you been getting on?
Oh well, relatively good, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I moved into a new house, so that was a big change.
Looks atmospheric up there.
Yes, that's my loft.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's my wooden cave. And I mean, all good. Let's say we are teaching now at Syracuse only online.
Yeah.
So it's quite complicated, let's say. I think especially for the students because they are a bit scattered everywhere.
Yeah.
Well, let's see what happens in the future.
Yeah.
How are you? All good?
Yeah, not bad. Yeah. Yeah, no, things are fine. I guess.
Yeah, I mean, could be much worse. I would say.
Yeah, exactly.
I have to say that London has been quite interesting in this quarantine, or let's say COVID condition.
Yeah. I miss the days of lockdown.
No, also like less people in the streets. It's kind of paradoxically turned more livable, I think.
Strange. Yeah, in a funny way. Yeah.
I've heard also a lot of people going out, like either going back to another place in UK or go back to their own native country or someplace cheaper.
Yeah. I mean, it'd be interesting to see what happens in the long term. Yeah. Is it true people don't like cities anymore? I don't know.
I doubt. To be honest, I doubt. But stuff like Canary Wharf, I'm not sure, because who likes Canary Wharf?
Yeah. I've always had a soft spot for it.
I know, but just from an anthropological point of view, not
sort of, but like, like I quite like the sort of bleak modernity of it, like I've always kind of fancied moving there one day, but I never have.
Okay, I'll take your word.
Like, so I haven't actually done it, so
Oh, here is Kyle.
Hey Kyle, how you doing?
Muted. How are you guys?
Good.
All right.
Yeah. Sorry, is the captioning thing working?
I think it is, because I've seen that I did nothing but Cindy as in between brackets.
Yeah, you have it. Good.
Captioner, which I don't think it's her second name. It would be a little bit awkward.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so as long as you assign her the role of captioner, then she can type.
It's that, and I'm keeping admitting people because I don't know how to remove this option.
Yeah, so if you go to security on the bottom left,
security,
and then just uncheck enable waiting room.
Great.
But now anybody can get in. It's dangerous.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure what they can steal.
Cindy said that the captioner is not assigned still though. So if you hover over her window and click the three bubbles, I think you can check the button that says assign caption.
Assign to type closed caption. Let's see if it works. Something appeared like a CC close to her name. It should be.
Yeah, she says all set.
Okay.
There it is. And then the only other thing to maybe remind people is if they want to see the captions, they have to click the button down below now and
Oh,
Click
yeah.
show subtitle.
Okay.
I like the subtitles on personally.
You can turn the volume down.
That's right.
You can watch TV.
No, for some reason, my wife always watches, like when we watch Netflix or whatever, she likes to have the captions on, and I always thought it was so annoying. Now I find it kind of pleasurable, like to have both options, to read and to listen.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I like it on. It's funny on, like, you know, live broadcast where there lots of mistakes and
Yeah.
yeah.
Someone was suggesting that the captioners for the debate the other night would have had a hell of a time trying to make sense of
Oh my God,
who was saying what.
True. True. You need to have two people at the same time with, like,
At least two.
yeah. Yeah.
Okay, it looks like we're all set, Davide. I'm gonna shut up and let you run the show again.
Well, the show is not mine. I will just have to, I guess, introduce Sam for the very few people that don't know him, I guess. Sam is, of course, the founder and leader of Sam Jacob Studio. He's professor of architecture at University of Illinois at Chicago, and also at Yale School of Architecture. He has been curator of the British Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, and I mean, exhibited in countless exhibitions, including, well, we were discussing it just last week, the famous Chicago Biennale, the column.
Oh, yeah.
He's been, of course, he's also a writer and a thinker, contributing to various magazines, including Art Review, The Zine, and Icon magazine. And he was previously one of the founding director of FET Architecture, which I would say, actually, some people told me has been a kind of groundbreaking practice at some point in the 2000s when it became known and famous. And well, I think it's enough, and I will probably leave the word to Sam. And I would just say that after Sam's lecture, we really welcome, of course, some questions and a bit of discussion. I have to say, this is we with the students of the London program. Of course, this lecture is open to a much wider audience, but with the students of the London program, we have been discussing the work of Sam, both in FET and in Sam Jacob Studio beforehand. So they will be definitely keen in asking questions afterwards.
Cool. Good. Scary.
Oh, exciting actually.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. It is, yeah, absolutely. Cool. Yeah, so Davide, like when you asked me to talk, you kind of like suggested a few things which, you know, this series is about. And you know, one of them was about, well, one is the survey of British architectural practices.
Yeah.
Another is a sort of like London through media, and a question of sort of architecture and media too, which is, I think, that's an idea that I've been interested in, you know, all the way through, I guess. And you also said, like, to understand the panorama of when FAT initially came in and how different that is to now. Well, I've put together a talk which is probably going to be quite rambling, but attempts to sort of deal with quite a lot of those issues. So I'm going to take you through some projects from kind of some early FAT work and the sort of context maybe, and the ideas which I was interested in. Like, it's always difficult to know, like, was anybody else that I was working with interested in them? maybe, but not actually. Kind of like turns out not in the same way, or not actually, or they didn't get it at the time, or that we thought we knew we were working on something, but we actually, in reality, we were all working on something different at the same time. So it's interesting retrospectively to kind of like find a kind of the many threads that may have been present to produce the tangle of work, which FAT definitely was. So I called this talk how do I do this? Do this first of all. Oh no, not that. I need to share my screen first, right? Yeah. Share screen, Keynote.
I think you should be able to do it, right?
Share.
Yeah, we're seeing it.
Great. So I called this talk the light bulb moment, and we will get to that light bulb moment, but it's maybe important because it was to do with a bit of a paragraph in a Marshal McLuhan book, and Marshal McLuhan being the sort of incredible media theorist of the 60s and 70s, who seemed to me to be incredibly prescient in terms of the kind of ideas and culture which was emerging in the 1990s, which is when FAT kind of came into being, like in the early to mid 90s, 94, 95, 96, especially when FAT was very unformed. Like it was never an architectural office. Well, it became an architectural office later, but at the beginning it definitely wasn't. But this is where the we or I is difficult to know. I was interested in the changes which technology was bringing to the kind of idea of media and idea of information, because of digital technology and because of the internet. And of course, who better to help you understand that time, which was exciting and full of possibility, in a way which definitely those things don't feel like now. Who better to guide us than Marshal McLuhan? So this is a time of the internet, remember, before it became owned by corporations, before we even knew what a web page was supposed to look like, where the idea of being connected to other people was absolutely incredible. So one thing that Marshal McLuhan wrote was that, which just like struck me like a light bulb going off, was about a light bulb. And he said that a light bulb is information, but that we don't recognize it as information because it's information in a pure state. Now, you could say, is that because it's like binary code? It's like 1 or 0, on or off. Like it is a form of code in a sense. Like it is pure information, i.e. not code which contains any other information apart from the fact it is on or off. But it struck me in a different way, actually, was that if a light bulb is information, is that a way that we could understand architecture? Of course, light bulbs are part of architecture. They might be a very small part of architecture, but they definitely are a part of architecture. So it made me kind of have this kind of revelation that architecture itself might be a form of information, communication, and media. And so the types of things which I was really really into, you could say, as I was leaving architecture school, as FAT was beginning, with these 3 things, was like the early version of the internet, information, the possibilities of digital tools, and unlike, you could say, many people, I was really into things which were not 3-dimensional, which were explicitly flat, or in a sense, they were tools for producing two-dimensional images, but we could understand them as possibilities of 3 dimensions. And those were Photoshop, on the one hand, and this was even before the days when Photoshop had layers. So it was a kind of high risk game, you could say. And the reason I loved Photoshop was that you could bring images together. So it was a kind of, you know, when it started, yeah, in those days when there were no layers, it was like a kind of almost replicated the age of collage of the, you know, 60s and 70s, or you know, in architecture of Super Studio and Archigram, or you know, going back to the 30s or whatever, where you were literally cutting found images together and sticking them together. Of course, as Photoshop develops, it became this incredible super collage tool. But what I loved about it was the ability of bringing together like information from varieties of different sources and recombining them in order to produce like a new third thing that was the kind of product of those things. And then the other thing I loved, the long lost and greatly lamented by me, Macromedia Freehand, which was a precursor to Illustrator, which was outmoded when Macromedia were brought by Adobe and they wiped it out. It was so much better than Illustrator. So and now it won't run on any machines anywhere for some horrible reason. And what I loved about that was it's like incredible flatness. I mean, of course, you get this with Illustrator too. It's like incredible flatness. Like it's literally no depth within it. And so those were the 3 things which made me really excited. Now, at the same time, what FAT was doing at that moment was not really making architecture, but was making, well, things we thought of as architectural, fundamental, really important architectural ideas, but not through the medium of architecture itself. So it would be projects like this, which is was called Ad Sites, and involved using the advertising sites on bus shelters and asking people to make work for it. So photographers, artists, architects, whoever, like kind of people that we know, but we kind of opened it up. So we'd managed to find the mechanism to get these spaces, which usually contain, you know, commercial information, advertisements, but for a month, for them to contain something which was not an advertisement, which was a different form of communication. And our interest in that was like, is this a way of designing an art gallery, but one that doesn't rely on all of the kinds of things which architectural art galleries normally. Yeah?
We are still seeing the light bulb.
Oh, weird.
It's the power of McLuhan, I think, but
yeah.
Sam, I think sometimes when you share your screen, you have to share the whole screen rather than just Keynote in order to have it advance when you're full screen.
All right, let me do that then.
Kyle, you're so proficient in Zoom. I mean,
yeah,
I've been living in here since March. It's not a great place to live.
This is what I was talking about. You can see Netscape.
Now we can see it.
Can see, well, that's Adobe, that's Photoshop 4.0, and there's Freehand. So yeah, this was Ad Site. So for us, this was like a kind of exploded art gallery that changed the way in which you would look at art and experience art, like waiting for a bus rather than in the hallowed high culture space of the art gallery. So what the artist was producing, how the spectator would see it, and its relationship to the city was entirely different. Now, that we began to understand these types of projects later on as somehow always involving an idea of communication. We did a whole series of them with business cards, with plastic shopping bags, with estate agent for sale signs, all of these kinds of things. And it was only retrospectively or some way through that process that we kind of realized that all of those were sites of communication in the city. At the same time, we had developed a sort of an approach which was very anti the prevailing mood of architecture at that moment, which was fairly like spatially kind of extravagant, you could say. So like the blobby digital projects, kind of the last embers of deconstruction with a digital edge. And we had we wanted to oppose that, but also we didn't know how to do that stuff. So it was a kind of twin engine. Plus we once tried to build it and it was just too expensive for the kind of work that we were able to get. So we had this attitude instead, which was anti-space. We were anti-space, but pro-taste. Now, taste being, space being the thing which architects talk about, space being the thing which is sort of beyond time, imagined to be beyond, out of its moment, to be kind of a specific quality for architecture. But we thought, no, there's so many other aspects which are never talked about, and one of those is taste. Taste being the thing which is on the surface, it's wallpaper, it's soft furnishings, it's the kinds of things you decorate your house with, not the design of the house. It's thin rather than deep. It's applied rather than like authentically the whole object. So there were a whole set of, like you could say, architectural issues about that thinness, that surface. But what it also was, why it was also important to us, was that taste was a thing which is engaged with the world. Like, we know that there are things like good taste, and we know that there are things like bad taste. We know that those decisions are to do with questions of value, questions of money, questions of class, questions of politics, questions of power. And we also know that they're not fixed. This year's good taste will be next year's bad taste, because that's how taste works. It's usually the thing which is completely dismissed by mainstream architecture, precisely because of its perceived kind of ephemerality. Like, it's ephemeral, so it's not important. We thought, no, actually, this idea of taste is where a whole set of ideas which seem relevant to architecture, you could say architecture is a political and social kind of act, they all reside in this idea of taste rather than space. Now, it was a reductive and you could say explicitly controversial a position that we were taking, and we made stickers. This recalls the sticker produced by the National Union of Coal Miners in the legendary industrial action strike in the 1980s, which is a ideological battle between the unions on one side and Margaret Thatcher on the other, and was kind of one of the key battles of the 80s, political battles, and their sticker read "Coal, not dole," dole being a kind of unemployment benefit. So as Thatcher was trying to shut the mines on ideological grounds, and shut industry on ideological grounds, and break unions on ideological grounds, this strike took on such important significance. So we were kind of co-opting that political kind of aesthetic with our own political statement in architecture: taste, not space. And we liked it so much, we would make that phrase again and again in the language of fairground lights, or in alphabetti spaghetti, taste you could actually taste. So that meant we were interested in, you could say, low code stuff rather than high culture. We were interested in everydayness. We were interested in DIY and what people did to their gardens and how we might understand that as a significant and important architectural project. People often thought we were kind of being ironic, but we were deadly serious. We saw in these kinds of places and these kinds of sites beauty, intelligence, incredibly rich, often competing and layered forms of culture that were not constrained by the ideas of good taste, which policed high architecture and design. Now, in Britain at that moment was the idea of good taste had taken hold in a very significant way. This was about the time of New Labour and Tony Blair's election, when very soon into his regime, he organised a summit with some European leaders, and he got Terence Conran to decorate the venue. And the decoration was incredibly good taste. It was a time of kind of cool Britannia. It was a time where IKEA was introduced into the UK, and its advertisements said, "Chuck out your chintz." Like chintz being the sort of, the name for like sort of kind of Victorian over decoration, too much patterning all over everything, like lampshades and velour wallpaper, all these kinds of things. So it was a time where pubs were being turned into wine bars, which meant stripping out all of the decorative embellishments and instead making a kind of like pseudo-minimalist, pseudo-European aesthetic. Now, we were interested in that as a phenomenon, and we were interested in the languages of architecture and design. We were interested, I think, because it felt like multiplicities of voice and expression through material things was being erased with a more singular idea, and we didn't like that. We're interested. So this goes to another issue, which was to do with juxtaposition, and also, I suppose, how you make architectural projects when you're not an architectural office. So this was a project called Mod Cons, and it took, kind of familiar bits of domestic equipment, taps, light switches. This is in Piccadilly Circus on Eros, on a lamppost. So juxtaposing those domestic devices with the urban environment, suggesting alternative ways of engaging with the city, suggesting a different relationship of the citizen with the city around them. So these are kind of visual, these are real life, they're kind of visual jokes, but they're real life Photoshop collages in a sense. And here's some real life Photoshop where the codes of the domestic environment are replaced with those of a military environment. So here, camouflage becomes the rug, the curtains, the upholstery, but also perhaps overcoding on the familiar, ordinary form of a typical domestic British house. So these ideas of coding, of course, chimed with things that we had found in all of these books, which were being sold in secondhand bookshops and remaindered bookshops about postmodern architecture, which nobody was interested in at the time. And we sort of saw in that work, just as we had in McLuhan, actually an amazing interest in the idea of architecture as media, architecture as information, that had been produced in the sort of mid to late 60s, early 70s. That was our favorite bit of postmodernism rather than the kind of later parts of it, but which already seemed to be talking about a relationship of communication to the built form of architecture. We were expressing ourselves in other non-architectural ways through our website. Now, you might think that's, of course, everyone has a website, but this was an early website, which was hand-coded HTML and it was not showcasing our projects, but was full of like kind of stuff which we felt was somehow relevant. All kinds of things. You know, it said modern architecture isn't that, it's this. I read a quote from Robert Venturi about our work, which was not boring, but in a good way. We would make statements about architecture. Dear reader, loneliness, boredom, depression, fear, worry, illness, loss of direction, jealousy, death and sorrow, divorce, selfishness, greed, disappointment, doubt, cynicism, anger and hostility. These are some of the hurts which plays an otherwise beautiful life. So, you know, we're kind of interested in the things which architecture usually tries to, let's say, suppress. So we were definitely not trying to be professional. We didn't know what that meant at the time. So, yeah, a company that makes architecture and art and all kinds of things in between, that explores the experiences of contradiction and possibilities of the modern world. At this time, I think we were sharing a building with Muff, who I think you're talking to, or maybe you have talked to before, and Caruso St. John. So we were all in the same space, but perhaps pursuing slightly different versions. Fat and Muff probably closer together than Caruso, but it's interesting just as a biographical kind of note. We'd make texts like this, How to Become a Famous Architect, which were both critiques of how the media landscape of architecture worked. It's so old, it says things like, fax your press release to a magazine, as if faxes exist, as if magazines exist anymore. It would have, this was a cutout model of Mies van der Rohe's gravestone that you could print and download. So it's full of kind of experiments in thinking about different aspects of sort of architectural ideas and exploring them through a medium of communication. And I guess, you know, I was definitely thinking like, oh, wow, if, you know, this is the equivalent of, you know, the kind of, the tight relationship between architecture and media that we saw in NATO, who were kind of Nigel Coates's group of kind of renegade London-based architects and designers in the 1980s, or Archigram in the 60s and 70s, but also the tight relationship between forms of media and architecture, books on architecture, going all the way back to Palladio, all the way back to you know, through the history of architecture. So would the website and the content of the website and the ideas we were exploring, could they be somehow in a kind of oscillation? One of our first projects was a nightclub in Swindon, a town sort of down the M4 west of London. And it was a project formed just by collage. So this was an early Photoshop. This was produced, I think, with no layers. Unbelievable. But technically, I have to say, it's a masterpiece. Like no mistakes, I think. And it was it stole OMA's La Valette arrangement, but kind of made it into this provincial nightclub. So you have a running track, a swimming pool, a road, an airport, and then at the end you have a garden shed. So it was in part the strategy was stolen from OMA, but the content was somehow, I guess, a little bit different. So this was the main room. You can see a running track. Our joke was like, you know, this is, you're walking down this running track, but you've had like 15 pints of lager, so you're in exactly the opposite state of mind. But remember, this was also the days, the tail end of the sort of the glory days of acid house and house dance music in the UK. So there's a lot of activity. So the sort of sports environment maybe wasn't so inappropriate. But this was the bit where we got really interested, I think. And this was in part sort of David Lynch and Twin Peaks inspired, which was obviously a big influence on design in the 90s to a generation who'd been amazed by Twin Peaks. And what you have here is a bar with a in the form of a garden shed, but with something gone strange about it, this sort of abstract stainless steel slice. But even more exciting was this horrible, horrible furniture, which we bought in a shop in Swindon, concrete logs, like the furniture you'd find in your grandmother's house. And so here we sort of, I think we began to really find a way that we could deal with an idea of taste. Like these were definitely bad taste objects. They were not, this was not good, seen as good design, but we could use it in a way which had incredible kind of power, I could say. Other kind of collage projects. This was an office for an advertising agency in Amsterdam, inside an old church. And if the nightclub was strips, this was chunks. So it was the sort of spatial organization was produced through a series of objects, and the objects were then given very specific characters. So like a cowboy fort, a piece of garden shed, a lifeguard's tower, patches of football pitch, bits of picnic bench, those kinds of things. So kind of fragmented narratives, one which would never and had no ambition to make sense. It was almost like the prop store rather than the theatre stage, but had elements of theatricality about it. Again, all of the references being things which were non-architectural in a sense, but deployed in an architectural way. A competition entry for the Millennium Bridge, which was another collage. This was it's called the Princess Diana Memorial Bridge. So that must have been 90. When did she die? 97, 8, something like that. So this proposed a pedestrian bridge, which was a strip of Althorpe Park, which was the home that she grew up in, an aristocratic estate that she grew up in. And this would like dig up that, capability brown designed landscape and string it across the Thames. So a precursor to the ill-fated Garden Bridge. But I think this one would have, anyway, this one also had Elton John's lyrics to Candle in the Wind 98, where he rewrote his song about Marilyn Monroe, about Princess Diana, carved in these monumental letters across the bridge. So here, I guess we're thinking about like not only the act of collage, like taking something which is extremely unurban and placing it into the urban environment that has a specific meaning, which is kind of inherent in the history of the picturesque landscape, but also its connection to wider culture. Memorial to Princess Diana. If you remember, I don't know, maybe you're way too young to remember, but London was incredible at that moment. There were these fields of flowers that stretched out around Kensington Gardens. It was a real kind of phenomenon, and a very kind of, people retrospectively say it was a very important moment in English culture, especially. It was one of the first kind of expressions of public emotion, of people expressing themselves emotionally in public, you could say. Perhaps the beginning of the sort of change in the kind of discourse in wider culture, which we're kind of sadly living through now. But this was, of course, kind of motivated by, like you could say, a really authentic sense of grief. Other aspects of collage. This was a small conversion of a Baptist chapel, which put the front of a barn into the space. Behind that was all of the the stuff you need in a house, bedrooms and kitchens and stuff like that. And then the rest of the space in front of it was kind of open space to live in, like the front yard in a way. So similar in a way to the ad agency, but slightly differently. Here, playing with those ideas of what is inside, what is outside, what is an architectural object, can one thing be inside another? Can we kind of play with those different notions? The idea of information and language became even more explicit. We designed a font that used half timbering. So half timbering being a kind of very despised, low code form of decoration that you find in a lot of English suburban scenarios. or attacked onto gigantic supermarkets, out-of-town supermarkets, to make them suddenly apparently fit in, despite their humongous size. So this was taking this debased form of architectural kind of language and explicitly saying it is a form of communication. Of course, half timbering has its roots as a structural system, like the black bits were wood, which held things up. But over time, that had become less and less part of it. By the 1930s, 1920s, Tudor-style houses just had thin slivers of wood attached to it, so they were entirely decorative. They were no longer performing their original role. And then we use that font, in this case with a slogan which says, "Kill the modernist within," at an exhibition we had in Manchester. So the thinness, remember the idea of flatness becomes very important. A structural system which becomes a coat of paint. Architectural language which becomes literal language. Ideas of architecture as information. Here, a neon sculpture of a house. They're taking the material language of signage and communication and somehow saying this is fundamentally an architectural issue. And then maybe the real light bulb moment, which was like, how can we translate these ideas into an architectural language? This was incredibly exciting for me. On the left, the Bezier curve of freehand and Illustrator. On the right, the jigsaw. What happens when you put them together? Well, suddenly you have a cheap, important because of the budgets that we were often working with, simple, super direct way of translating information into material substance itself. That was the light bulb moment. It was like this for me. This was me. And it allowed us to do things like this. I mean, maybe I haven't got all of the projects here, but the Blue House, the villa in Rotterdam, where really it's the cut becomes the way of turning an inert piece of building material into something. It's like a form of supergraphic, but a material supergraphic. Here, slightly pulled away from the facade of the building to form a kind of arcade in a sense, a way of embedding narrative into that. So it kind of works a little bit like a cartoon strip. You kind of read, or a frieze, you read it left to right, from industry to nature to housing. The front of that same building. Here, a kind of frontage to the BBC TV studios in Cardiff, where they film shows like Doctor Who, the sort of celebrated science fiction show, but also British TV shows like Casualty, which is like a hospital drama, and Public Cum, which is a soap opera, but the Welsh, in Welsh for Welsh TV. And we took many of those motifs of science fiction monsters, bits of hospital, and mashed them together to produce this facade, behind which is a strip of offices, but then the big sheds where they actually film everything. So that was a kind of, the flatness, the way you can, in such a direct way, make something have content. So we were interested in that idea of content and that quick communication of it. Things got maybe more interesting, maybe, well, they were interesting for me at the time because it suddenly was something different. I got very frustrated by how that excitement of using a jigsaw to make architecture became a formula for that. So I was excited by ways of thinking. This was for the Venice Biennale in 2014, which took the Villa Rotonda, took a shareware model that freely downloaded from the internet, and turned it into a mold and made a cast from the mold and displayed all of that stuff as an object. So it here began to think about the idea of not just information as a fixed state, information as something which is transmitted from, you could say, architectural form to models, from physical to digital and back again, even through the production, like the way in which a mold, you use a mold to produce a cast. And those ideas, I think, have been part of these sorts of projects. This is a little thing I've been working on over the last few years called The Most Photographed Barn in America, which is the most photographed barn in America, which is in Jackson Hole in Wyoming. And here are just some of the photos of the most photographed barn in America, usually taken from the same spot, but like, you know, sometimes really good photos, sometimes really shit. And so this has just been using some software which takes flat images and reconstructs 3D form, photogrammetry. Otherwise, here it is. So these are all found photos from the internet, which are then used of the most photographed barn in the world in order to produce a model of the most photographed barn in the world, but not a model of the barn, but a model of the information which has been produced through the fact that it is the most photographed barn in America. So that the kind of the resolution, the angle, the sort of content of the photo becomes folded into the architectural form itself. Of course, I love all the mistakes that it produces, the glitches, which reveal the fact that this is not a model of a barn, it's a model of a very specific aspect of that barn. Here you can see, you know, roof becomes mountain, etc. This idea of the remake has been, I guess, like part of a stream of work that I've been working on. This was a project called Very Small Part of Architecture, taking Adolf Loos's unbuilt design for a mausoleum and making a one-to-one model of it in Highgate Cemetery, a very apt location, as accurate as we could make it in its form, but is inaccurate in its material. So a thing which was intended to be dark and heavy and impenetrable becomes lighter, translucent, becomes a sort of resurrection. We thought that was an interesting idea of the remake as a kind of resurrection. And of course, interesting to resurrect something which was never born in the first place. It only existed as a form of, you know, as a form of media. Same, in a way, similar kinds of ideas. You could say more collage, but how do you produce an architecture out of architecture? This was the project for Chicago Architecture Biennial, remaking, or yet more proposals for the Tribune Tower. So this took the form of the massing of Adolf Loos's famous Doric proposal for the Tribune Tower, but it made it out of slices of buildings. Now, in the real Tribune Tower, there are these studs in the base, in the sort of a lower portion of it, of other fragments of other buildings. There's a bit of the Great Pyramid, Notre Dame, like what you name it. There's like, and they all have their names like written on it. So if you walk down Michigan Avenue, you can sort of like see these fragments of like tiny bits of spoiler. So that became the library for producing this. So these are all buildings which have a presence in the base of the real Tribune Tower, here assembled into something which is sort of both fragmentary and whole at the same time. Fragments and wholes, well, kind of plans which are definitely not plans, but which are composed out of elements which are half remembered, completely banal, incredibly unusual. So this is sort of like plan as a fetish object, you could say. So the information of a plan not being something which is there in order to allow something to be constructed, but it's information as plan for the sake of being the plan. So in a lot of these projects, there's an idea that the thing is the thing, like a statement of itself is essentially what drives it. More fragments as elements of furniture, more borrowing and remaking, like here, objects from the V&A's collection remade in varieties of different materials on stools or plinths, which are cut-ups of the Eames famous turned wood stools, but cut up with things like Coke bottles and Dr. Pepper bottles, So you kind of, again, multiple references kind of engaged in one object. And yeah, I think I'm getting to the end here. So this is something we're working on now. How might these ideas now play into a form of architecture which completely wants to resist? So this was mainly designed about 4 or 5 years ago, just at the end, well, just after FAT, and is now on site. And it's a project which is both about how a building can just repeat itself. It's on a U-shaped site, and it is basically produced by reproducing that U shape again and again and again. It's a kind of, its language is explicitly kind of boring, back of terrace, back of like kind of London row houses, kind of brick, but then punctuated with a kind of rip-off Melnikov house. So again, sort of like explicitly not trying to be the communicative facade that FAT became known for, but somehow embodying itself as a piece of information, like the information simply being that of the site. And then, of course, what talk would be complete without a sales pitch, a range of products which turn architectural motifs, or architectural things we're familiar with from the world of architecture in different ways, into bits of clothing. So a half-timbered t-shirt, you can suddenly wear the facade which you might live in, or the insulation scarf, which takes the international drawing symbol of insulation and makes it into something which can insulate you. Or this was scale bar scarf. So this is a life-size scale bar, 2 meters long. So you can carry it around and then do some measuring up as you find something you need to measure. So, like, I don't know if that gives much of a clue as to the origins of FAT. It's sort of its own like attitude towards the rest of the world and London at that, you know, in the 90s especially, or whether it gives an idea about like a take on the relationship of architecture and media, which, if I was to sum that up, it would be to say is like, number one, to recognize that architecture is a form of media. Number two, that the forms of media we produce in the pursuit of architecture, you could say drawings and models, are architecture, and that are kind of on a spectrum where everything is evenly understood as a form of media, building, model, drawing, and that the understanding that might give us is that actually buildings are not real. Buildings are a form of representation just as much as a model is. And if we understand buildings as a form of representation, then I think that opens up so many questions about how we might then kind of interrogate the possibility of what building might be. Representation not only in the sense of media, but in the sense of what content does it contain? Representation in who does it represent? All of these kinds of big political questions, which you could say it's similar to a question of taste, but perhaps it's a wider and less specific question. Maybe it's something which is more open-ended, rather than assuming that there are positions, pre-existing positions of, let's say, good and bad and kitsch and high and all of those kinds of things. So I'd say, yeah, that is the current which runs through most of the work that I've been involved in producing, is always to think, or to try to understand the ways in which architecture operates as a form of media. And maybe that would not have happened if it hadn't been for slightly misunderstanding Marshal McLuhan back in the 1990s. So I think I'm going to stop showing things at that point. Yeah.
Well, Sam, thank you very much. Perfect timing, I would say. We said, yeah, quite slightly longer, but tastefully longer. And no, thank you very much, because I think it's really, for me, it's really interesting also that you accepted this kind of, to talk about this kind of transition, if you want, or like of this slight, maybe it's not even an evolution, but change of the way in which you have produced architecture before with FET and then later on with St. Jacob Studio. Of course, many things, there is clearly a continuity. There is something, before, it's just the only thing I want to ask, because, and then I would like to leave the questions to the other, the people of the audience, let's say, and the other students, because it's something really interesting to me that happened when we discussed your work beforehand, let's say. So I asked actually some students to present your work, which I thought was already quite interesting. And then something came out, the discussion observed by the students in a way, that is, they found that actually the main difference between FET and St. Jacob Studio might be the idea that FET was very explicit, let's say, in the kind of putting forward this very strong language, let's say, and also that the kind of reference of this language was more perhaps, let's say, a general discourse, let's say, in some ways, in which of course FET maybe wanted to break in and show other possibility, while they observed, and this I found very interesting, that in St. Jacob Studio, let's say, there is a stronger involvement of, let's call it the user, or the kind of let's say the people that the project is addressing, but as a specific entity, not as a cultural fact, let's say. For example, we were discussing quite a lot the project that I really like, that is the barbershop art gallery, in which, in a way, there is I mean, of course, there is the language and there is all the things you were very clearly saying, but there is also something about the actual, in a sense, involvement of the person, and a kind of in a much more direct way somehow. And I wonder if you agree with that. I had never thought about this. Actually, the students really brought this up, and I thought it was quite brilliant.
Yeah, it is true, I would say. So for, you know, it's a funny thing to stop doing something after a long time. Like, so I've been going for about 20 years and become really familiar about, like, you know, kind of like how we would do things and why we would do things. It become like, you know, kind of problematic in that sense. So yeah, you know, that's kind of why we decided it had to end. It was a conceptual decision rather than anything else. So yeah, just having a second act meant also saying, well, it cannot be a continuation, a formal continuation. Like, yeah, sure, there may be ideas which are similar, but I want to find another way to produce them, or to conceive them, or a different materiality, or a different sense of space, or a different sense of use. And I think that is true. I'd say there's a much more of an interest in, for me at least, in space and use than you would typically assign to a FAT project. With DK UK, the hairdressers, you know, you could say there's similar ideas in a sense to, you know, to the bus shelter project, which is like 1994 or something like that. Like, i.e., how do you experience art or produce art outside of the context of an art gallery? And with DK UK, it's very important for it to be a functioning hairdresser, because what Daniel, who runs it, his sort of message from it, or the sort of if you think of it, the whole thing as an artwork, is that the art gallery does not support itself. It receives some Arts Council funding, but it needs to have the commercial activities in order to be able to pay the artists and curators to make work and show work. And so all of the ideas of framework, all of the ideas of, you know, use of, also that you would never look at yourself. So the key issue is you never see yourself in the mirror getting your hair cut. You only see it at the end. So those meant that we always wanted to make frameworks and make it look like an armature. We wanted to use mirrors, but not functionally, but spatially. So all of that kind of is part of the, you could say, the design principle of it. But yeah, it shares so many like fundamental ideas with a project like AdSite. Like, what happens to art when you put it into a different context? Can it perform in a different way? What happens when it's kind of messily combined with hair products and the economy of hairdressing? Recently there's a lot more perspex gone in, kind of COVID style. So luckily we had a design language which could accommodate pandemics very easily. So it's, yeah. So I think that's true, but I think that's a determined kind of attempt to escape from the surface. So when I was talking at the beginning about flatness, about surface, that is the one thing I don't want to be working on. I mean, that's not always true, but yeah. So yeah, space and use become important sites for the way in which, or I could also say material. Also, like I think we've done quite a lot of work with like kind of weird materials, like so, which is also another kind of non-fat way of working. Fat was kind of like, its bluntness was kind of part of its power. A bit like, you know, the kind of cliche of punk is you just need 3 chords. Like in Fat, all you needed was a plank of wood and a jigsaw. Like, you wouldn't be like, oh, this is a beautiful material. You'd be like, okay, it's this cheap, it's direct. And I think that is, yeah, that's again, yeah, something that I see a lot of value in, but couldn't keep working on, or that perhaps there are other forms of bluntness, maybe. I don't know. Yeah, that was my thoughts. But I do agree with your students. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So who some more questions from the audience? I don't know how to do that, but raise your hands or start talking.
Hey, I'd love to ask a question. I've been a long time kind of like shower of the Darabou Said project.
Oh yeah.
And I was hoping it would find its way into the narrative of replicas. Like specifically, as you were talking some earlier, you were talking about sort of the ethos of technology and postmodernism, and kind of how within FAD or within like your own practice, you've been counteracting that.
Yeah.
And I'm super interested to figure out how that fits into the narrative.
Okay, yeah. So for those of you who don't know, this is a project that was involved the 3D scanning and making it uses the technology to make a one-to-one replica of a kind of ad hoc shelter that was part of the so-called jungle, which is the kind of or was at that time the kind of migrant camp on the just in Calais next to the Channel crossing, which of course is which is endlessly being demolished by the French police and clearly demonized by the French and the British authorities. So what that was about, so in a sense, what it produced was a kind of monumental version of this ephemeral structure. It did that as part of a show, part of an exhibition for the Victorian Albert Museum. And Victoria and Albert Museum is a place, obviously it's a place of high culture. It's a repository of important objects, but it's not, the objects are not necessarily authentic. So one of its great spaces in its incredible building in South Kensington is a room called the Cast Courts, which are, you know, plaster casts of amazing pieces of architecture, or what were considered to be important pieces of architecture in the 18th and 19th century. So there's a, you know, it's got a cast of Trajan's Column, for example, which is too big to be put together, so it's in two halves. Now that is a record, of course. Yeah, and the casts were not produced not only for the V&A, but they were a mechanism, really, of, like, you could say, the Beaux-Arts for transmission of architectural and design and cultural knowledge. So you could produce lots of versions of Trajan's Column, and you could encounter it, and you could go as a student, and you could draw it, and you would learn how to be a good designer. And you know, unlike often the case is today for students, is that in some ways the best Beaux-Arts student, it was the best at slavishly copying what was in front of them, rather than producing something which was original and iconoclastic, which is a different conception of what good might be. So so the idea of that was to produce something in the manner of the Cast Courts, but of exactly the opposite type of structure. So if the Cast Courts and the culture that it represents, you know, art history essentially celebrates, you know, essentially it's a story of the victors, like literally in Trajan's, in the case of Trajan's Column, it is the story of victory. And in the production of the replica of this shelter, it was a completely different story. It was not the victors. It was something which was not permanent, was not grand, was not significant. But by giving it the same status, by putting it into the same collection, somehow we felt that it would kind of go some way to rectify that story. And its ephemerality was so, you know, it was so ephemeral that the shelter itself was bulldozed far more quickly than our replica was. So yeah, I don't know. Those were some of the thoughts which existed around making that piece of work. Was yeah.
Some more, please. Students and professors.
I had a question.
Patrick.
Hello. From early software to modern technology, like the photogrammetry, it seems like the experimentation with new tools is consistent. So I was wondering if you found newer applications, like being able to design in virtual reality and designing art in virtual reality, if that was something you're interested in experimenting with, and to discuss the further digitization of architecture and art.
Yeah, I'd say I'm not necessarily drawn to the cutting edge of technology. What appeals, I think, like photogrammetry really appeals to me because I love the way that it inherently has this relationship between the two-dimensional and the three-dimensional. Like, it works from flat photography, two-dimensional photos, things you can take on your phone, no special lasers or scanners or anything like that, and it interpolates from that set of information a three-dimensional object. So it has a translation built into it in the way that it works, which which definitely like made me so excited when I understood that existed. But I also liked it because of its ability to produce replicas and its ability to, let's say, move between the digital world, the physical world, the digital world, and back into the physical world, which also has its own form of translation. Like information is lost in the process of scanning. Information is lost in the processing of that as you know, as a point cloud or whatever resolution it might be. It's definitely lost in its translation back through a CNC machine, so that what you end up with is something which is close to but not the same as the thing which it originated from, in much the same way that so it's not like a digital copy which is exactly the same as the original file, indistinguishable. It is more like in terms of music, like more like recording a record onto a tape. That it would pick up extra information and lose information. So that really appealed to me. I'm interested in, I suppose, that the translation of ideas into things. And sometimes that involves technology, and I like it very much when technology leaves its trace, or the media, I would call it the media rather than the technology, leaves its trace on the object. So that most photographed barn is like exactly about that, the trace of imperfect information, too low res, not enough angles, taken by people who were on holiday, not documenting a building, and the kind of holes and gaps and that leaves in the reproduction of it. But yeah, we did a show about perspective and the sort of the space of perspective. We tried to make an installation which was almost virtual, in that it had projections front and side, in theory behind as well. So it was a digital model which had things flying towards you. And if you stood in the space, you were inside the space of the drawing. So, you'd see it originate, an object coming towards you there, and then it would be there, and it could theoretically be behind you. And that was a show about how the tools of representation that we use are not innocent or neutral, that they leave their own traces on what and how we design. So, if you design in perspective, in short sense, if you design in perspective, you'll most likely produce something which is different to if you design in plan or if you design in axonometric. In the same way that, if you design in SketchUp, it'll be different to if you design in with a pen, most likely. And also the specific histories of perspective as a drawing system. And because of course, these kinds of drawing systems themselves have their own histories. They have their own way of imagining what the world is, which also leaves its trace. So you could say the technology that we were interested in making that show was perspective, which is not, it's maybe not something we would normally think of as technology, but absolutely is. And a technology which is still embedded in, even the ways in which software shows us things, even embedded in perhaps even the very concept of virtual reality, in the sense you can trace perspectives history along with technologies of viewing devices. So from Brunelleschi's experiment with a painting and a mirror, where he would look through the back of the painting and see the reflection in the mirror of the painting joining up with the world, to the technologies of camera lucidas and camera obscuras, to cameras, to projectors, to virtual realities. These technologies are linked. So for me, it's always about understanding, I guess, the role that technology or the media has in shaping the world. So yeah, I think I would love to make some virtual reality things somehow, Patrick. Yeah. Are you good at it? Are you good at it? I need someone to help me.
Unfortunately not.
Too bad. Too bad.
Thank you.
Hi, Sam. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So it seems like in a lot of like the stuff you were talking like on your presentation, like you were concerned about this idea of like communication or this architecture language, and kind of like expressed through like the surfaces or objects or let's say materials, and also the building that you were showing on your slides. So I'm just wondering, like maybe this is like more relevant to this year, you know, like we're all kind of like been through this kind of like COVID situation where everyone maybe got to get stuck at home more than often. So I'm just wondering, like the communication right now between people apparently become like more virtual as we are right now. So I'm just wondering, like, does that kind of like change the way you thought about like your design approach maybe in the future, or even in like immediately like this year?
Oh yeah, but in some ways these are ideas which we were I was so not only Marshal McLuhan, but this amazing quote from Robert Venturi is that Americans don't need piazzas, they should be at home watching TV. Which is another, another like, that was another light bulb moment for me, which was like, oh, Jesus, like, oh my God, like, yeah, of course, of course I know TV is like a sort of form of public, but is it a piazza? Oh my God, that's so amazing. But also might explain why the concept of a piazza does not really fly that well in the US, as opposed to, medieval Italy, you could say. So, yeah, in some ways, I guess like the situation we've all found ourselves in is a sort of accelerated version of the world we were living in before. Like we could have done this type of lecture discussion for years, and like weirdly, on the whole, we didn't do it very much. I'm kind of glad that we do now. Does it change? Has it? Yeah. So I'd say for sure, like the consequences of media, or communication media, consequences like they're intimately bound up with an idea of public space, and the blurring of like what is digital and what is physical public space, I think is a really important evolving issue, which is definitely more than Venturi's TV. What does it mean now? I guess it also means like the context of making work is another thing, which I think is that I've been struggling to think of that, especially in relation to teaching, actually, this year or this semester. Is like what constitutes a project when it feels like the kinds of things which you would normally do in a studio, like, make a big drawing, make a big model, like can't really be done because you guys are all at home without much access to workshops, in likely smaller spaces, like, on the whole, much more difficult to make something big or print something big. But even if you could, you wouldn't be able to show it to anybody. So it would always be, even if you could make a giant model, how would anyone see it? We'd only see it on a screen. Mark would see it, like glance at his phone as he's driving around and go, oh, that looks nice. So that raises the question of like what constitutes a project and how related is the media you're working in, to the project itself. So, does that mean that we know, of course, how Instagram has changed aspects of architectural language? You could say color, you could say composition, you could say that certain aesthetics have been transmitted through the particular medium of Instagram, as opposed to Twitter, as opposed to Facebook. So my question, which I haven't got to a conclusion, it'd be maybe interesting to hear how you guys are dealing with it, is like, what constitutes a project? And part of that, for this by Christmas, and important to that question is what media is that? Like, that's something I'm trying to trying to figure out with my students at UIC, yeah, like what is a project in 2020?
Hi, Sam. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi, Mark. How you doing?
Good. Great. Wonderful.
That's so good. It's so good you're driving around.
I wouldn't miss it for anything. I want to maybe follow up on the Piazza TV reference.
Yeah.
And I was really excited that at the very end of your lecture, you mentioned politics again. But you know, it started out talking about taste culture and politics and Thatcher and Conran and Tony Blair, and then in the middle talked about sort of sociality of Princess Diana's death, or the emergence of an open social kind of politics and personal identification, public, you know, sociality. And I guess I'm just wondering for you, you know, and especially now, I think when so much of politics is really about taste culture, you know, I'm also thinking like Denise Scott Brown, you know, her interest in taste culture. You know, just wondering for you, how do you see your work's politics, or is that not important? You know, is it a matter of taste operating as politics, or, you know, is it a kind of hegemonic? Are you at all interested in kind of the hegemony of taste, or is it always this you know, anti-taste, or
yeah, I guess, like,
you know,
yeah, I mean fat was definitely like aggressive, aggressive in its aesthetic, and so that project in Rotterdam, Denise Scott Brown said, oh, it's like aggressive prettification, which I thought was such a amazing way to describe it, because it was, yeah, it's like it's doing things which are decorative, which are usually thought of as being like relatively harmless because they're more ephemeral, and because they're not taken seriously, but done in such a way that they have a kind of a sharper edge. They're too big, they're too rough, that kind of thing. In some of those projects, there's narratives which were embedded, like you know, that project in particular, its references were explicitly to do with the landscape around that project in an attempt to build a kind of shared civic language, that if you were, you know, a 75-year-old you know, Dutch pensioner, you might relate to as much as if you were like a 14-year-old immigrant from Suriname. So that it didn't talk about, like, you know, kind of references to historical forms of architecture, or in fact any recognizable forms of architecture, but things like cartoon trees, that kind of thing. So the sort of political idea there was like, could graphics and representation form a shared public language? So it was aggressive in terms of how it's constructed, aggressive in terms of its visual field, but not in terms of its kind of taste references. You might say it's bad taste because it's aggressive, but like, it's not like some other fat projects which were explicitly, you know, this is a horrible sofa and it's published in a design magazine. That's a win for us. Again, my feeling now is that, I don't know, like the context of politics or the general kind of cultural context is really different. Like, I feel that that those modes, A, of explicit narrative, and B, of kind of kind of anti-taste, I just can't work like that anymore. I don't know if that's me, because I've spent so long doing it and I kind of want to escape from the straitjacket of working in that way, or if it's the context of making work now. So I would say what I'm trying to do is to sort of swallow, like, kind of design languages, use them in a kind of more engaged or more synthesized way, so that they're not so declared. I don't know, Mark, if that, I feel like, you know, it's more difficult to be ironic. It's more difficult to assume that there could be any attempt at having a fixed meaning. It's more difficult to work in a kind of 1990s way. You know, you could not be in the Spice Girls and wear a Union Jack dress in 2020 in the same way you could in 1996. It means something different. So yeah, if it's different for the Spice Girls, it's definitely different for me.
Well, it seems that the social network have exploded taste.
Also true, maybe. Also true. Or narrowed it, you know, like in another strange way. Like everything, aesthetics get flattened as much as it shows you the world. It also changes the world, I guess. Yeah.
But there was recently an article in an Italian magazine, let's say, speaking about how in the 2000, for example, in Obama's campaign, there was this kind of beginning or culmination, if you want, of the great narratives, no? This narrative of the story of, the great narrations, reconstructing this narration. They are not anymore the political narration of the previous century, but other kind of narration. Yeah. And then this article was also arguing that now this time, in a sense, is over. Like through the overruling of the social network, not even the narrations are actually all very exposed people like American presidents or others. Let's say they have to invent a narrative every 5 minutes. So there is no more grand narrative in a way. And I think maybe could be said the same about taste somehow.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was reading something about, it was comparing David Bowie to Lana Del Rey, and it was saying like you could say like culture is okay and understands an idea of Ziggy Stardust as an invention that is a fictional character which can be killed, and understands that it can be that David Bowie can reinvent himself. But they were saying like Lana Del Rey is much more misunderstood because her kind of presence is kind of almost kind of changes almost all the time, and not necessarily in such a theatrical way, that she embodies these kind of different familiar kind of ideas of kind of mediated ideas of gender in the roles that she performs and the narratives that she suggests. But it was exactly that kind of fluidity and lack of explicitness about the falsity of it, which made Lana Del Rey more difficult for, on the whole, let's say middle-aged culture to understand, but why it made her much more important than David Bowie now. So I think what you're talking about, I guess, is the ways in which let's say media is communicated, the speed and the amount changes what is communicated, that they are not separate things. As McLuhan, of course, told us, it's not the content, the medium is the message. And I think that it's another good example of why McLuhan was always right.
I think more or less, unless there is a really last second question, we have 5 minutes maybe, but I don't know if there is some student that wants to.
I have a question.
Yes, last one.
So we keep entertaining this sort of band metaphor, which I quite enjoy in relation to your work. And so I'm curious if, keeping with that metaphor, you have any sort of B-sides that you'd be keen on distancing yourself from, maybe?
Yeah, a lot. Oh my God. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, well, you know, like, I would say it feels like a career of B-sides rather than you know, kind of platinum sellers, platinum selling albums. You know, or maybe it's just a great singles band. I don't know. You know, like yeah. I don't know. It's interesting. Like, what makes a project significant? Is it the project itself? Is it its timing? Is it, you know, how it's perceived by other people? It's really hard to tell from the inside. I don't know. Like, I mean, it's very nice of you to remember the Everyday Fat. Like, it already seems so long ago, and sort of almost pre. Well, it's definitely pre this version of the internet. Like, so whether it still exists whether anything exists outside of the current media, you know, is a question, I guess. Maybe it has mystique. I don't know. Maybe it does. But yeah, a lot of embarrassing B-sides, Drew. Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, on that note, I think we can definitely close very happy. Well, Sam, thank you very much. I think it was really enjoyable and very also, I mean, thought-provoking, like in the sense of there's a lot to think about, I think, in this moment as well. And your work it's kind of, I mean, it refers to different kind of medias, but it's still the themes are still very urgent, I think. And so I hope really you all enjoyed. And yeah,
well, thank
you.
you.
Say? See you soon.
Yeah,
on these screens.
No doubt. Good luck with the semester. Good to see you all.
You too.
Yeah, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.